Thank you, Carole.
Well, of course. Thank you so much, Congressman, for inviting me to come back to speak to all of you. It's so wonderful to be back and amongst several people with whom I've had the privilege of working in the national security community with. And I'll also start by saying, as a former Army officer, and also I grew up as an Auburn fan and then went to UGA, so I'm terribly sorry, War Eagle and Go Dogs, to our Alabama colleague. But first, and Chris made so many poignant points, which he always does, about national security issues. So based on some of that, I'll start instead with a bit of a personal anecdote that helps set the scene for my worldview and how I've ended up returning to the National Security Council after my first term here in 21 and 22, and the administration asked me to return about 5.5 months ago to drive some time-sensitive issues. So I learned how to don a gas mask within 9 seconds by the time that I was 12 years old. My family lived an hour south of the most heavily defended border in the world, in South Korea. When my father was stationed there, all family members who live in South Korea for active duty servicemen and women get issued gas masks in case of a potential chemical attack by North Korea. And it was especially impactful to me, where it taught me, even at that age, at 12 years old, that no matter what my status was as a non-combatant, as a child, that would not save me from a gruesome threat once unleashed, and potential devastating demise. And basically that led me to then want to serve in the national security community. And I was in the Army as a Chem Bio Red nuclear defense officer, and then worked in intelligence. After that, my first tour at the White House, I worked in cybersecurity, spent some time at Senate Homeland, and then went to Treasury, where I first got exposure to blockchain and cryptocurrency, because when you work to combat cybercrime and cybercriminals, you inherently get into the cryptocurrency ecosystem, and then enter my time at the White House and these 2 tours at the National Security Council. So all of this, why I brought up this me learning to don a gas mask, besides the fact that it helps paint the story for now, why wherever the nexus is of econ and technology with national security sits is where I like to sit. And it's interesting to now work in a space where, as Chris pointed out, the White House has stated that North Korean cyber actors are using cryptocurrency to fund half of the proliferation activities of the regime through cybercrime and through cryptocurrency heists. That is not an accident. It's not because it's not because it's a harder asset to use to successfully money launder. That's not inherently inevitable, though. Cryptocurrency isn't inherently evil. No technology is inherently evil. It all depends on the design and the operation of the ecosystem that you've built in with technology, through operations, through the critical controls that we all put in as part of regimes for nations, as well as that industry puts in place. Since industry, especially in something like finance, sits really on those front lines of conducting certainly the commercial activity, but also being able to detect and stop illicit actors who are exploiting their platforms in order to exploit consumers and national security interests. So innovation isn't bad. Innovation is at the heart of certainly the American economy and also the nations that are represented here. It drives how we generate jobs and how we create new and interesting ways to be able to provide critical goods and services to our citizens. But responsible innovation does not mean unchecked technological advancement without regard for democratic principles and for rule of law and other necessary principles that we have across societies and nations. So we have to embrace responsible innovation, whether talking about blockchain, central bank digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, or the other emerging technologies that the former panel was speaking on, like quantum technologies as well as artificial intelligence. We have to leverage the opportunities of, as Chris mentioned, programmable money. That is what is offered in the world of blockchain-based cryptocurrencies, as well as digital currencies like central bank digital currencies. Being programmable doesn't make it bad or good. It's not inherently evil or inherently good. It all depends on that design of what it is that we decide to program it to do. On some of the specifics of the national security threats that can be presented by a blockchain, as well as the opportunities to benefit national security, we have issues like financial stability, where there are particular features of blockchain-based cryptocurrencies that can potentially be a benefit for stability, right? For those of you familiar with cryptocurrencies, essentially what you have is, with blockchain technology, the ability to use a public, immutable, or unchangeable ledger to be able to create unprecedented transparency. And that transparency can be incredibly beneficial when you're trying to audit or oversee or just gain trust and understanding of what is in fact happening in a market or in a payment system. That can also present potential risks for consumers who may not want to publish their financial transactions and information on a public, unobscured ledger. I don't publish my credit card statement on the internet online, not because there's anything illicit in it, but the world doesn't need to know the embarrassing amount of money that I probably spend on DoorDash and Amazon. So again, like it all depends on the features of these particular systems, and the way that you implement it is going to implicate different elements of national security threats or national security opportunities, like where transparency can help law enforcement and people like Lilia who've been for years, spending their entire careers trying to trace and hold accountable the illicit actors that are using cryptocurrency. But then when that information is public, like if investigators can use that to attribute who you are, does that mean that all of your financial information is now attributable and visible publicly for any actor to see? That can be a potential national security and consumer nightmare. Illicit finance is also obviously something near and dear to my heart based on the work that I've done at the National Security Council and at Treasury. And I'll start with cybercrime since that's where I came at this from. Ransomware would not exist to the extent and scale that it does today without cryptocurrency existing in its current state. Again, that's not cryptocurrency being evil or illicit, that is just the current state internationally of regulation and compliance in the space that have made it a really valuable tool for cybercriminals to use cryptocurrency as their primary means to purchase exploit kits, to ask for ransomware payments, and then to launder those proceeds. That's not an accident. It's also not inevitable. Cryptocurrency could become an ecosystem where we could dare criminals to launder on a public ledger. That just requires certain controls to be built in through technology, through regulation, and through partnerships, like with the nations that are represented here, as well as through industry partners, like many who have been represented on these panels. So sanctions evasion is a great example. There was an action that Treasury just announced highlighting where a Russian sanctions evasion network was also using cryptocurrency in order to fund some of their activities. Investment fraud, and it's called in some places and circles pig butchering. I don't like that term, so let me just call it investment frauds and scams are increasingly using and relying on cryptocurrency as a means to be able to defraud consumers and convince them to invest in these schemes and then to successfully launder those proceeds. So people around the world, victims around the world are being affected by these schemes. And we need to figure out how to put in place the necessary measures to prevent child sexual abuse, narcotics trafficking and human trafficking activity, fraud, cybercrime that are using cryptocurrency. On the positive side, I mentioned the public immutability and traceability of these records. SWIFT, Fedwire, CHIPS, they do not publish to public records. So there is a huge benefit from the investigative side to be able to conduct investigations to hold accountable these illicit actors, as long as the necessary anti-money laundering regulations are put in place in the jurisdictions through which these funds are moving. So that means relying on things like the Financial Action Task Force, which I know many of the jurisdictions here are represented there. Many of you, in fact, were huge vocal advocates for us passing the first ever international standards for virtual assets in 2019, when I was the lead delegate for FinCEN to the FATF for us to create those. We need to implement those standards that are absolutely critical and will help us then ensure that the right records are in place to hold accountable those illicit actors that, again, are exploiting cryptocurrency in order to exploit consumers. So focusing on, I know I focused a lot on illicit finance. That makes sense based on the seat where I come from, and National Security Council folks were good at some of the worst case scenarios and things that concern us. On the positive side for blockchain, another critical component, just as the captain next to me and also Chris highlighted, competition and leadership and technological innovation and reinforcing the centrality and role, certainly for the US inside of the financial system, is absolutely critical to our national security might. As again, both speakers previously mentioned, our economic strength is not divorceable from our national security strength. And we've seen that with the consequences that we've been able to impose through unprecedented sanctions against Russia with our international partners in order to hold them accountable for their continued war of aggression against Ukraine, and the fact that we use sanctions also to cut off illicit actors from the global financial system and to impose those consequences. That demonstrates the utility of economic strength as part of a tool that we need to use, but also how we need to be especially targeted about it. And cryptocurrency and those public ledgers allows us to be very targeted when it can support things like attribution. And on competition, there are many nations that are trying to find alternatives to a US dollar-based and denominated system. Now, the US dollar is not going to stop being the global reserve currency in the near future. The reason why it exists as the global reserve currency is because of the faith in our highly liquid markets and our rule of law and and the strength of the United States dollar for a lot of reasons that go well beyond just technological efficiency. But we are seeing the fact that other nations are looking to develop alternative payment systems, whether through use of cryptocurrencies for sanctions evasions or developing central bank digital currencies explicitly with the deliberate purpose in order to create a way to circumvent the dollar and our reach. These are points of concern. And I personally also am concerned when I think about decentralized finance and growth of cryptocurrency. Even if there's continued reliance on the US dollar as the global reserve currency, what happens if it's not just a change to the reserve status, but a change to the role of correspondent banking? These key national security tools like sanctions and anti-money laundering frameworks really rely on correspondent banking relationships to gain some of that visibility and be able to leverage those tools to be able to leverage those national security tools. So all of these are potential national security implications if we don't make sure that we're driving the US as a key hub and focal point for competition also in the cryptocurrency ecosystem and blockchain ecosystem, as well as the future of digital payments, regardless of what form that it's in. So what does that mean about what we need to be doing to drive those and preserve those national security interests? It means that we need to be shaping that responsible innovation that I spoke to before. That means a whole of nation approach in thinking about properly calibrated regulatory frameworks that ensure to combat the greatest risks and take an appropriate activity-based approach and doesn't vilify a particular technology, and then also pairs the regulation and the requirements that must be in place to defend the rule of law and defend the consumers and the citizens who are being hurt through narco-trafficking, human trafficking, cybercrime. But in order to protect them, we also need to maintain that economic strength, and why we need to promote positive innovations that are needed in this space, like privacy-enhancing technologies that can address those consumer concerns, but also make sure that appropriate discoverability still exists inside of these ecosystems without potentially exposing consumer data publicly for everyone to see. We need to promote standards around ensuring greater cybersecurity of these platforms. If North Korea is so successfully targeting decentralized finance platforms, we need to improve the cybersecurity measures that are being put in place on cryptocurrency platforms. And we also need to ensure that our regulatory framework is one that achieves the right balance of promoting innovation and enabling that, but also stifling the greatest risks that are presented to our financial system, to our national security, and to our consumers. These are all lessons that we can learn through policy enforcement and compliance actions, as well as through partnerships with industry. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you all. Look forward to any questions that remain.
Excellent.